NASA says none of the seat restraints, helmets, and spacesuits used by the doomed crew of the Space Shuttle Columbia worked well as the ship disintegrated during re-entry.
Explorers off the Florida coast are almost certain to forever be reminded of one of the greatest tragedies in space travel history.
RB hydraulic power units have started. T-minus 21 seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start.
It looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
The night before the launch, Boisjoly repeated his warning.
But with the previous shuttle having just set a record for delays, NASA's leaders were impatient.
Boisjoly's bosses told NASA the O-ring evidence in the memo was inconclusive. Challenger's launch was ordered.
When Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart high over Texas on February 1st, 2003, the world watched in disbelief as a streaking line across the morning sky turned into a fiery cascade of debris. It had been a perfectly clear day, one of those crisp winter mornings where the atmosphere itself feels sharper than usual. People in small towns and rural communities across Texas and Louisiana stepped outside to watch the shuttle streak by, as they had many times before. But this time, something went terribly wrong. At 8:59 a.m. Eastern Time, the orbiter disintegrated, killing all 7 astronauts on board. It was a national tragedy, a haunting echo of the Challenger disaster 17 years earlier. But beneath the headline of Columbia Lost, there was another story, one less publicized but equally sobering: the fate of the crew's remains. What actually happened to their bodies during and after the disaster is a story that combines the brutal physics of re-entry, the relentless work of recovery teams, and the quiet dignity of a nation in mourning. The 7 astronauts aboard STS-107 were Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon. They had spent 16 days in orbit conducting scientific research inside the SpaceApp module. Their mission had been smooth, even joyful, filled with video messages to classrooms, experiments, and the kind of camaraderie that develops only in the silence of space. None of them knew that 16 days earlier during launch, a brief moment had already sealed their fate. A piece of insulating foam had broken away from the external fuel tank just 81 seconds after liftoff and struck the left wing at speeds approaching 800 kilometers per hour. It tore a hole in the thermal protection system, essentially the shuttle's shield against the inferno of re-entry. NASA managers knew about the foam strike but decided not to pursue on-orbit imaging or rescue options, believing the crew could not fix such a problem anyway. As Columbia began its fiery return to Earth, the damage that had been overlooked came back with lethal force. Superheated plasma, hot atmospheric gases, poured through the breach in the wing and began melting the aluminum structure inside. The shuttle started to yaw left as drag increased. At first, the automatic systems compensated, but as the structural damage worsened, the flight control systems couldn't keep up. The first warning the crew received was a landing gear sensor error at 8 hours 58 minutes and 39 seconds. Within a minute, the vehicle began to lose hydraulic pressure. A master alarm sounded. The pilot, William McCool, manually reset the autopilot at 9 hours 0 minutes and 3 seconds, proof that at least some of the crew was still conscious and working. 15 seconds later, the shuttle's body began to break apart. What followed was violent and swift. At 9 hours 0 minutes and 18 seconds, the Columbia orbiter experienced catastrophic structural breakup at Mach 15, traveling faster than 17,000 miles per hour. The crew module, where the astronauts were seated, separated from the rest of the orbiter. This wasn't an instantaneous vaporization, as some might imagine. The breakup was captured on an Apache helicopter's infrared camera. Columbia fragmented into multiple glowing objects streaking through the sky. Inside the crew module, the astronauts were suddenly thrown into a chaotic environment of violent spinning, depressurization, and searing heat. NASA's investigation later determined that the first lethal event for the crew was the sudden depressurization of the cabin. The exact moment is unknown, but it happened within seconds of the breakup, no later than 9 hours 0 minutes and 59 seconds. None of the astronauts had their suit visors closed, one wasn't wearing a helmet, and 3 weren't wearing their pressure suit gloves, indicating they didn't have time to respond. Depressurization at that altitude renders a human unconscious in fewer than 15 seconds. Tissue damage occurs rapidly. They likely lost consciousness almost immediately and did not experience the subsequent events in any meaningful way. After depressurization, the crew module continued to tumble violently, rotating on all 3 axes. harnesses. The astronauts' lap belts kept them anchored to their seats, but the inertia reel systems in their harnesses failed to tighten properly, leaving their upper bodies unrestrained. Their helmets, which were not snug-fitting, allowed their heads to slam against the interiors of their helmets during rotation. The helmet neck rings acted as leverage points, increasing the risk of spinal and neck injuries. NASA's Crew Survival Investigation report found that the crew sustained significant blunt force trauma to their upper bodies and heads during this phase. Thermal trauma also played a role. As the structure around them failed, superheated gases entered the cabin, scorching the astronauts through their Advanced Crew Escape Suits, ACEs. Though the suits offered some protection, they weren't designed for sustained exposure to plasma or molten metal. Eventually, the crew module itself disintegrated completely. When it did, the astronauts were violently exposed to the near vacuum of high altitude, sudden wind blasts, and shock waves. The force of the airflow likely tore parts of their suits away from their bodies. After that, their remains, now separated from the module, fell through the atmosphere individually. For several minutes, they tumbled through layers of sky, from near space temperatures colder than 50 degrees C, down through blazing layers heated by re-entry friction. Some parts burned or fragmented further in the process. Ultimately, their bodies fell to Earth, along with thousands of other pieces of Columbia's wreckage, scattered across a debris field stretching from East Texas to Louisiana. The search for the crew began almost immediately after the breakup. Residents across Texas reported loud booms and saw streaks of flaming debris falling. Local law enforcement agencies received hundreds of calls. Some thought a plane had exploded. Others simply stared at the sky in shock. NASA quickly deployed teams to the region. Astronauts Mark Kelly and Gregory Johnson took a Coast Guard helicopter from Houston to Nacogdoches, Texas, one of the primary impact zones. Jim Weatherby led another team to Lufkin to help coordinate recovery efforts. Within hours, reports of human remains began to surface. Searchers found the first pieces of crew remains on the very day of the disaster. These weren't intact bodies, they were fragments, some small, some more substantial, scattered among twisted metal and scorched shuttle parts. Within 3 days, remains from every crew member had been located. The recoveries occurred along a narrow corridor south of Hemp Hill, Texas, and west of Toledo Bend Reservoir. These were rural areas, wooded, swampy, sometimes remote. Local volunteers, Forest Service workers, environmental protection officials, and military personnel scoured fields, forests, and creeks in a massive coordinated search effort. It would become the largest ground search in U.S. history. The discovery of remains was handled with solemnity. Each time human remains were found, searchers halted other work and called in special recovery teams. The remains were carefully documented, collected, and transported under military escort. By February 11th, just 10 days after the disaster, the final body of a crew member had been recovered. From there, all recovered remains were transported to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where military forensic specialists worked to identify and catalog them. The Columbia crew's remains were scattered but not lost. The recovery teams identified remains from all 7 astronauts, allowing for formal funerals and burials. NASA coordinated closely with the astronauts' families, maintaining strict privacy around the details. Out of respect, most of the information about the exact nature and condition of the remains was never publicly released. Only through the later Crew Survival Investigation report did some of the grim technical details emerge, not to sensationalize, but to help prevent similar tragedies. The report examined every moment of the breakup, every failure of equipment and procedure to ensure that future crews would have better protection. The emotional impact of the discovery was profound. Many of the first responders and volunteers were local residents, farmers, hunters, and forest workers. These weren't hardened NASA professionals. They were ordinary people who suddenly found themselves part of a national tragedy. Many later described the experience as life-changing. Some stumbled upon personal items like mission patches, notebooks, or pieces of the astronauts' suits. Others found remains in remote woods. One searcher described finding a fragment of a flight suit tangled in tree branches, swaying in the breeze like a ghostly reminder of what had happened. The debris field itself was immense. Thousands of pieces of Columbia were eventually recovered, cataloged, and laid out in a vast grid inside a hangar at Kennedy Space Center. There, investigators reconstructed portions of the shuttle like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle to understand how it had come apart. Human remains, however, were treated separately, with reverence. Each astronaut's remains were returned to their families once identified. Some were buried in their hometowns, others at Arlington National Cemetery. Alain Ramon's remains were returned to Israel, where he was mourned as a national hero. In the immediate aftermath, President George W. Bush addressed the nation. This day has brought terrible news and great sadness to our country. The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors. It was a brief, somber statement, acknowledging both the scale of the disaster and the dignity owed to the crew. Behind the scenes, the recovery of the bodies continued for weeks, often in difficult conditions. Rain, mud, and the sheer vastness of the terrain complicated efforts, but the determination never wavered. The investigation that followed revealed harsh truths. The foam strike that led to the wing damage had been a known risk, an accepted flight risk in NASA's internal language. Managers had downplayed engineers' concerns and canceled a request to get Department of Defense imagery of the shuttle's wing while in orbit. No plan had been made for in-orbit rescue, even though it might have been theoretically possible to launch another shuttle to retrieve the crew. The tragedy spurred sweeping changes, new inspection procedures, emergency rescue plans, and stricter engineering oversight, but those changes came too late for Rick Husband and his crew. The fate of their bodies is a stark reminder of the human cost behind space exploration. In popular imagination, shuttle disasters sometimes get compressed into moments: a fiery explosion, a streak across the sky, a single point of failure. But the reality is more complex. The Columbia crew didn't simply vanish in a flash of light. They endured seconds of chaos, their remains scattered across miles of countryside. Hundreds of people spent days and nights searching for them, recovering them piece by piece, treating each discovery with care. In the end, every astronaut was found. They were brought home. Their names are etched into memorials, their faces remembered not just as victims but as explorers who gave their lives in service of something larger than themselves. Their remains, recovered from fields and forests of Texas, passed through the hands of strangers who became caretakers of their final moments. And though the shuttle program would continue for 8 more years, culminating in its retirement in 2011, the memory of Columbia's crew remains a solemn reminder that spaceflight, for all its wonder, is never without risk, and that when tragedy strikes, the story doesn't end at the edge of the sky. It comes back down to Earth, where real people have to pick up the pieces.